to have a word of thanks for a very good friend who's helping out backstage, Barbara McClintock, Program Director of the Jung Institute. And Barbara was also instrumental in bringing Joseph Campbell together with the Grateful Dead. And so a special note of thanks for that, too. I think there are three institutions, sort of in the Bay Area, Esalen, the Jung Institute, and UC Extension, who work together to make these events happen. Our own sort of academic rituals and raptures. And it's wonderful to work. It's wonderful to work with such fine colleagues. Our next speaker is John Perry. John is a distinguished Jungian analyst and psychiatrist, the author of a number of books, among them Roots of Renewal in Myth and Madness, The Far Side of Madness. John has also been the founder of a special residential facility called Dionysus House for young adults in acute schizophrenic break, in which they could live together with people who cared for them and not have that experience interfered with by drugs. This led to his enormous interest in the visionary aspects of the schizophrenic experience. And about 18 years ago, he and Joseph shared a platform comparing the events, the visionary events of the acute schizophrenic experience, and seeing the intense parallels between those visions and the hero's journey. John's topic today is madness, creativity, and transformation. John Perry.
Good morning. I'm very impressed with the timing of this event. Today, as you may know, is All Souls Day. Dionysus was a god who spent half his time in the realm of death, and his feast day in Athens was a day of the Feast of the Dead. All Souls Day is the Feast of the Dead. It's the old Celtic New Year. So here we are, joining the Grateful Dead, and all the deadheads are also gathered together here today. And this is a very consistent theme running through the morning. The main thrust of what I'm going to be presenting may sound a little bit less cheerful than rapture and ecstasy, but it does belong together with that. I'm going to play the role of the heavy in this, I think, because it's the Dionysian principle that vital aliveness is born out of the realm of death. That's the miraculous revelation in the Eleusinian mysteries, when at the climax of the whole series of events, there's a burst of light, and Persephone appears with her divine child, newly born, out of death. That's going to be my central theme. In American culture, this is not good news. It's not welcome to think of death having anything so good as this to provide. When we think of these high states of consciousness, the price of admission to this high state is taking account of the role of the death experience. In America, we're very biased against suffering and death as if they were the ultimate enemy, sinister and dark, to whom we give no quarter, no tolerance. You might say it's on an equal footing with madness. These two are greeted with about the same kind of feeling. And that's a matter I'm going to try to throw light on during this hour. Wish I could see you all out there. I'm facing a sort of burst of darkness against this light. But anyway, amidst looking into your eyes. The growth process of the psyche sees this whole thing very differently. Because to break out of the security of solid consensus and convention involves the experience of the death process. And at the same time, hand in hand with that, the dissolution and destruction of the familiar and accustomed worldview. This entails the death, psychologically, the death of the self-image, the familiar self-image, and the destruction of the familiar world image to make room for the regeneration of each. These two images move together, the self-image and world image. Each is an aspect of the other, and as a matter of fact, they're both represented in the same image of the mandala. Now, to illustrate the play of these images, I'm going to talk about these three arenas that Len has mentioned: creativity, madness, transformation. By madness, of course, we imply deeply ordered states, non-ordinary states of consciousness, what I like to call visionary states. And of course, we're not implying the psychiatric view that sees all that as a chaotic disorder with bizarre ideation and without much hope. But that's what we're not talking about. We should call to mind Plato's familiar rendering of this in his Phaedrus, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in which Socrates, with his delightful humor and wit and beautiful eloquence, make very clear the value of madness. He says there are two kinds. One produced by human infirmity, the other by divine release from the ordinary ways of men. Nice expression. In this last kind, he speaks of there being several prophetic visions, the mysteries, creativity, called lyric, and the love experience. Now this third kind, which is a possession by the muses, when what enters into a delicate and virgin soul, their inspiring frenzy awakens lyric. He who, not being inspired and having no touch of madness in his soul, comes to the door and thinks he will get into the temple by the help of art. He, I say, in his poetry are not admitted. The same man is nowhere at all when he enters into rivalry with a madman. He had it. Beautiful passage to read. Now, our star witness during the first part of my talk is going to be Shelley and his Prometheus Unbound. Why this? Wasn't he just a dreamy romantic? I used to think so until I read deeply into his life and his work and found that, in fact, Shelley was a vigorous, energetic revolutionary who advocated nonviolent confrontation, expressly in the form later picked up by Gandhi. It isn't usually recognized that Gandhi learned about Shelley and this particular method of warfare when he was a member of the Shelley Society in London. The only reason he didn't acknowledge it was that Shelley believed in free love, and that horrified Gandhi. He couldn't go along with that, so he kind of disowned it. But Shelley was writing, he said himself, to a future generation. So 100 years later, Gandhi picks up the thing and actually actualizes what Shelley had described in poetry. Now, Shelley had a very beautiful view of what poetry is. He said, in ancient times, what we call prophets were the poets. That is, the faculty which contains within itself the seeds at once of its own renovation and social renovation. Poetry could redeem the time, the source of whatever good in an evil time. It images the children of airy hope, the prophets and parents of mysterious futurity. I think Shelley did carry that out. He was a prophet in that sense, and his Prometheus was his vehicle for describing his vision. When he wrote the Prometheus, he was in a very non-ordinary state of mind. He was spaced, you might say. He describes in a letter to a friend, Mary Shelley published this along with his poems. At the time of composing the Prometheus, he wrote this letter saying, "My feelings at intervals are of a deadly and torpid kind, or awakened to such a state of unnatural and keen excitement that I find the very blades of grass and the boughs of trees present themselves to me with microscopic distinctness. For hours between sleep and waking, I'm prey to the most painful irritability of thought." I think a lot of us recognize that the earmarks of that state of mind. It's out of that he had his visions, which are in this poem. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on the drama itself. It is, as you probably know, a drama of the transformation of the world, strictly mythological form, by the overthrow of Jupiter as the archetype of kingship, representing the tyrannical, repressive role of the establishment as an evil. Jupiter had been instructed to rule wisely over gods and men, but he violated the privilege, causing untold oppression and suffering among the people. Now, Prometheus is a little like, as Shelley says, Milton's Lucifer, rebelling against the tyrannical Jehovah. Prometheus here becomes a savior, a suffering savior, transforming the world through his suffering on the icy rock in punishment by Jupiter. He undergoes a personal transformation of his own image. One of the Oceanides, one of the three sisters that Prometheus is with is representing Shelley's own visionary state, his own visionary experience. And she, in the drama, describes a vision of Prometheus released from the rock. His wound-wore limbs fell away from Prometheus, and the azure night grew radiant with the glory of that form, which lives unchanged within. And his voice fell like music, which makes giddy the dim brain, faint with intoxication, keen joy. Now, the drama ends, as I say, with the transformation of the world, which now becomes, under the rule of Prometheus and his consort, Asia. The two of them represent wisdom and compassion or love. She also represents nature. So it's a redeeming of nature from the position it has been put in. It's a world without hierarchies, without boundaries, without rigid institutions, or borders, or wars, or contest for power. It's a world ruled by the principle of love. Now, the remarkable thing about the writing of this is that the drama ends with that in 3 acts. But Shelley was not content to leave it at that. And instead he adds a 4th act, which is a joyful cosmic dance of spirits in celebration of the newly transformed world. In it, a play of circular forms, mandala-like forms, with colors and lights all revolving in ecstatic vision with music of the spheres. So I'm going to quote a bit of that. It's a very ecstatic experience that Shelley was obviously envisioning as he wrote this. So again, this particular sister of the Oceanides is having this vision. From an opening in the wood rushes with loud and whirlwind harmony a sphere, which is as many thousand spheres, solid as crystal, yet through all its mass flow as through empty space, music and light. 10,000 orbs involving and involved, purple and azure, white, green, and golden. Sphere within sphere, and every space between, peopled with unimaginable shapes. And they whirl and over each other with 1,000 emotions. Slowly, solemnly, they roll on, kindling with mingled sounds and many tones, intelligible words and music wild. Now, from the head of the spirit of the earth, shoot forth this vision of vast beams, like spokes of some invisible wheel which whirl as the orb whirls. Swifter than thought, filling the abyss with sunlight lightnings, and perpendicular now and now transverse, pierce the dark soil, and as they pierce and pass, make bare the secrets of the earth's deep heart. Really visionary experience. Obligingly to us, he compares the state of the moon, who's infatuated in love with the earth, as being like a maenad round the cup which Argive lifted up from the weird Cadmean forest. That's the Eleusinian mystery. Now this transformation of the world image in Shelley captures some of the essence of the creative process. It reminds me very much of what Frank Barron has written about on the basis of researches at California Berkeley. I had a chance to participate in those briefly, and had a really nice learning experience about what creativity is. Frank wrote his own book after the researches and said of the creative person that the creative vision requires an act of rejection, breaking the previous world structure. In these individuals, we see frequently an ability to transform the ordinary boundaries of structure of consciousness, to break through the regularities of perception, to shatter what is stable and constant in consciousness, to go beyond the given world. Such individuals are involved constantly in the creation of their own private universes of meaning. They are cosmologists all. They destroy the world and they recreate it. It takes the work of the symbol to bring this about. And he says there's certain aspects of this creative process that are very much like the breaking of constancies that come out of a psychoactive drug experience. Now, when we reflect about the nature of creativity and its relation to madness, I think we should bear in mind Roland Fisher's work. I'm sure it's familiar to you, many of you. His research is on altered states, non-ordinary states of consciousness. Roland used psychoactive substances for his experimentation, and back in those years when it was still possible to do such a thing, to investigate the array of various states of consciousness. And from these, he provided a cartography. Now, his model was an arc, which there's nowhere to draw here, so I'll draw one in the air, you can all see. Up here, at the top, is the normative ego state, which he calls the commissar. Over here to one side, as you look at it, states of increasing quiescence, quietude, tranquility. It reaches what the Zen practice reaches, an empty consciousness, one-pointed, until the ultimate point of enlightenment at the base of the arc and the one, total unitive state. Over here on the other side, up here is creativity, because it goes in the direction of a hyperactive psyche, activation. through a sequence of high arousal states. It leads first through creativity, then it gets anxious, so we have anxiety along the way. And then a state of actual, what he calls hyperphrenia. Much better word than schizophrenia. Schizophrenia doesn't mean what it describes. Hyperphrenia is a turned on mind where it's highly active, highly aroused, and very productive of vision and myth and emotion. So we note here that along this arc of creativity, anxiety, hyperphrenia, there's a continuum. And the continuum is merely made by the degree of energy, activation, and sped up condition. Now, we'd have to concede that over on this side, also, there is creativity. Abraham Maslow wrote about that in a beautiful chapter on creativity in his book, one of his books, in which, in the state, the beginning state of a creative process, the state of inspiration, there's a complete absorption on the part of the subject with the matter at hand. So that subject and object blend, they lose the differentiation. And this results in a state of bliss, rapture, over this end of the arc, where there's a unitive state. And it's said by Taoist painters, for instance, that if you paint a bamboo, you become the bamboo. If you paint a horse, become the horse. That's in the direction of quiescence, of unity between subject and object, and an absorbed concentration of consciousness. But today I'm going to follow the other side of the arc over here, where it gets more and more active and toward the high arousal state, with this turbulent outpouring of vision. Now, I'd add to Frank Barron's statement about creativity. These people are, yes, cosmologists, but they are, as Shelley said, also prophets. Prophecy is a very important part of the deeply creative process. It leaves the customary world image, worldview, and it leaps into an unknown future. There's a research of the last 20 or 30 years among cultural anthropologists from which we've learned a great deal about the nature of prophecy and prophets. In various times, in various parts of the world, in times of crucial rapid culture change, it's typical for the great visionary prophets to behold overwhelming images of world destruction and regeneration. World cataclysm, earthquake, flood, fire, storm, wiping out the customary world, and then envisioning a newly regenerated world in its perfection. It seems that over the course of history, perhaps fresh myths and cults have arisen out of states like this, out of such visionary experiences. So poetry, prophecy, visions of world regeneration tend to be linked together in a cluster to draw upon death and the realm of death for the reinvigoration of life. Now, it's puzzled me about Dionysus that, I should call him Dionysus this morning, but he is a very spooky figure arriving in his ceremonials and causing clamor and pandemonium, and he is very much opening up the deeps, opening up the realm of death into the everyday, on the occasion, particularly the Feast of the Departed. He is also an inspirer of poets, hence the Greek drama, which grew out of his rituals, Greece's highest poetry. So, in trying to link up what it is about the association of death with creativity, I looked around at various myths and looked into the Norse myth. I want to share a few impressions I got from there. Their prophecy is a great part of the Voluspa. That is a poetic prophecy written by a poet in the early centuries from materials of even older times, who put his verses in the lips of a kind of shamaness, a sibyl prophetess, telling of the god of poetry and inspiration of bards, called Odin, narrating his exploits in the last days of his world order. So it belongs to our theme of creativity and prophecy and world destruction. He has many characteristics, as Shiva does, in common with Dionysus. Apparently, this is a primordial kind of myth that subsists from a very ancient time, where in various parts of the world the same archetype is active, as Joe Campbell has told us so beautifully this morning. Now, in the Viking Age, Odin became a god of warriors and kings, and that part is not our interest today. It is in his older, more primordial level, showing his affinities that I'm speaking of, causing intoxication, possession, leading to ecstasy and inspiration. He was the personification of a thing called wut, which means furor, wild excitement, raging, madness, frenzy. To be possessed by him is to find oneself in ecstatic trance by which one discovers one's poetic genius. So he's the old wanderer, gray-haired with one eye, which he sacrificed, and accompanied by 2 ravens and 2 wolves. These are creatures of the realm of death. The realm of death was very important to those people in Scandinavia. It was the source from which one learned wisdom. Poets would hang around tumulus mounds and graves, sit on top of a burial mound to receive inspiration and wisdom from the dead. Now, Odin went even further than that. He had a habit of sitting on the gallows and getting the dead who were hanging there to tell him their wisdom from the other world. Something you might do when you're trying to think of your PhD topic sometime. Recent inspiration about the forest monks, sit on a grave. There was something of the shaman in Odin. He flew through the air on an 8-legged horse. 8 legs represents the funereal bier. 4 people carrying it. 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, who would carry him through the air to and from the land of the dead. On him he also led the wild hunt with his band of ghostly followers in the winds and storms, much like the Bacchantes, or the ones that are described always as Shiva. His festival was the Yule, darkest day of the year, when bands of his followers would be dressed as wolves and cross over the countryside, rampaging and marauding. Odin was of great age, immense wisdom. He was a leader of souls who would conduct people to the other world. He said not to eat, even as his wolves that he had with him did, but to drink only wine, but more especially the mead, which is honey, which gave wisdom and inspiration. That was no ordinary mead, by the way. Just as it did with the original form of Dionysus, who came from Crete, and before he became a wine god, was the one who invented honey and the fermentation of honey and the high arousal state that comes from mead. So poetry was known among these people as the cup of Ig, that's another name for him, or the mead of Ig, and the holy cup of the raven god. These ecstatic states from alcohol and mead and poetry were considered holy and brought into ritual, since it was thought to bring one into communion with the gods. So the oldest poet tells us of Odin sacrificing an eye down in the underworld at the root of the world tree by the well of Mimir, sacrificing an eye to Mimir to buy from him the gift of the cup of mead, which gave him poetic inspiration. And she also narrates Odin's self-sacrifice on the world tree, Yggdrasil. He says, I know that I hung on the windswept tree for 9 nights, for wounded with a spear and given sacrifice to Odin, myself to myself. He peers down and grasps the runes from the abyss, and shrieking, he says, he brings them up and falls back again. Very dramatic picture of what it is to buy your poetic inspiration and your magical power. Now, finally, the Völuspá tells of the end of Odin's order, of the world of gods and men. As you know, this is, I'll say first, this is preceded by 3 years of a sort of deep freeze, a nuclear winter, if you like, in which the entire world is frozen over. And then leading up finally to the disastrous Ragnarok, which is the final Armageddon between the gods, with a complete destruction of the world. The wolves eat the heavenly bodies as well as the gods. Now, this then was followed by a rejuvenation of the world, a regeneration, and a transformation of that world into an age of benevolence. Now, in this very darksome Norse mythology, I've picked an extreme example, I guess, of the association of creative inspiration with the realm of death. There's some similarities to Dionysus, but they're also remarkably different. Both inspire poetic inspiration, frenzy, madness, intoxication, using the mead in the early form. But there's a strong contrast. In the Norse myth, there's nothing of the feminine, where with Dionysus, he was a darling of the women, he was the lover, he was tended by nurses, the Maenads, and his great festival was essentially a festival by and of the women. True also of Shiva. Walter Otto writes a beautiful book about Dionysus and brings out that ghostly aspect of Dionysus. He said he raves, he makes mad, incites to savagery and lust for blood. So he was not just a figure of the lovely sort of ecstatic rapture. He had this dark side, as Odin did. He called him a wild spirit of the dreadful, mocking all institutions, creating bewitchment and ecstasy and paralysis. The routine world with him becomes shattered. No illusions are left, only truth, which makes madness, where dimensions of time and space lose validity and the laws lose their power. Dionysus stripped mortals of all conventions, all that is civilized, and hurled them into a life intoxicated by death. It was not just destructive. He brought also bliss. He was enraptured, as follows, and creative. All these share in the wildness and madness. As bromios, which translates into din. He was the loud shouter of joy, accompanied by shrill instruments, flutes, drums, pipes, cymbals. He was the liberator, revealing hidden things, revealing the future. And the air around him was filled with prophecy and miracles. So Otto says, creativity never comes out of insufficiency. On his threshold, we're thrust out of all that's secure and settled, every haven, and flung into primeval cosmic turmoil in which life is intoxicated with death. Now that's a form of world destruction, of course. To beget something alive, we dive into the primordial depths, the depths where the forces of life itself all dwell. Now I want to bring out some of the more joyful aspect of the picture of death, and refer to the work of Ken Ring, which I'm sure many of you know, who studied the near-death experience. Now that's a highly ecstatic state in which people, for a few moments or a few minutes or even longer sometimes, are clinically dead. They've gone over the other side into a different state and are able afterward to tell what that was like. So I'm briefly just going to describe to you that aspect of that realm of death, of the ancestors. One is filled with immense alacrity and speed as one approaches a golden light that glows with overwhelming brilliance. Now this is hundreds of people who have this experience. It seems to be like an archetypal sequence. The various elements are common from one individual to another. Here's this golden light that glows with overwhelming brilliance and yet doesn't hurt the eyes. And in the presence of that light, one feels pure love, total acceptance, forgiveness, a sense of homecoming there. And in this death space, there's a communication with the light that's instantaneous, nonverbal, in which one learns wisdom, in fact. Immense information pours in rather instantaneously. It imparts knowledge of a universal nature. And accompanying all this, transcendental music, paradisal environments, beautiful landscapes, cities of light. And once having encountered that light, one yearns apparently after it to remain with it forever. I need hardly tell you that when people have come back from that experience and tell the nurse or the attending physician it's bad news, they're considered absolutely psychotic and they're forbidden to talk about that anymore. They're going to get treated psychiatrically. That's what it is with visionary states. Now, you may wonder why I'm ranging about in so many fields and among these various motifs of death and world destruction. But it is to provide a background from which to recognize the transformative processes going on as elements in an attack of madness, what's called psychosis, but which I like to think of in the first occurrence of it as a visionary state. So we'll draw these themes together. Dying, world cataclysm and regeneration, eruptions of the primordial mind, these all occur in this state of hyperphrenia. Now, this is no place to give a case presentation. It's hardly fitting. So what I'm going to do instead is create a composite picture of various visions, various experiences that actual people have had, that I've gleaned from a large number of persons, in this state, a very large number, as they were actually observed during the process of psychotherapy in the acute episode. So this will be the example of young Miss Alcase. Miss Alcase. As you listen, by the way, just keep reminding yourself that it can sound pretty wild and pretty crazy, but very visionary, and if you only remind yourself that what makes it sound crazy is that this person has the tendency to identify with every motif that comes up across the mental stage. If it went up to that, it would sound very different. The arrogance of the inflation is often enough to knock the wind out. And it rather spoils the effect of what otherwise a very wonderful dramatic vision. Now, young Miss Alcase, 28 to 30 or so, she's for a few days been rather withdrawn and ruminating in her inner thoughts and sleeping too little and eating too little. So this in ritual would be fasting and vigil, but it's spontaneous in this case. She's been convinced very recently that she's dying, and gradually the outer world begins to lose its sense of reality, to seem more and more unreal, and the sense of reality instead has been shifting to an inner space of vision and myth and the primordial world. So what she has done, she spent the night in the position of the crucifixion, with pains pulling at her chest, drawing her immense pain across here. She's convinced of the dying. In the morning, she believes herself to be in the Garden of Eden, to be Eve herself, maybe to be her daughter. And she herself feels like a little girl again. And this place is the center of the world, and the time is the beginning of time. Now the world itself, she's possessed by the odors of death that she associates with the devil. And the people around her seem also to belong to the realm of death. They're like the living dead, and even zombies. At times she feels herself to be in heaven, sometimes in hell. The world itself seems to have regressed back to its first years, just the way she did. In visions, she sees the creation going on in space. All is utterly black except for little rings of light that come down and join each other and start to form galaxies. And she sees the land rising. Finally, when the world is created, the land is rising from the waters. And she sees the primitive races moving about. And all seems very primordial. She has overwhelming fears about this creation, that there are powers that want to destroy it, or perhaps take it over and domineer it tyrannically. But this is balanced by other creative forces of good, and these are expressed mythically as Christ and Antichrist of the good and evil, or perhaps in political language. And the ideologies that come with these different factions differentiate, become 2, and then 3, and then 4. But phrased in political language as if it was mythological language. Now, all the issues of life seem to be separating out into opposites. And whereas the usual order of things goes all topsy-turvy, masculine and feminine and other opposites. She has a mortal fear of being turned into a man. But the sense of who she is swells to huge proportions in in her inflation. With a rush of emotion, she becomes the goddess, the female counterpart of the creator. And as the divine creatrix herself, she creates 3 stars, and she creates the moon, and she peoples them. And her own proportions of herself and of her body expand infinitely, till she seems to be, in fact, the whole world, and to be the personification of the Earth Mother. This is accompanied sometimes by an epiphany. People come and adore her at the top of the stairs. At night she participates in sexual union with God. By this union conceives a new divine child, a savior, a new redeemer who's going to bring a new world order. There are visions like standing as king and queen, she and a lover, and another couple on cosmic globes arranged in outer space. That's a kind of sacred marriage and a quaternity. It's unbelievable that come out of these visions are people who've never read Jung, never read these medieval alchemical texts, but the psyche just pours these things out spontaneously. At first she believes herself to be pregnant. This is the occasion for many pregnancy tests, by the way, and admission. And she experiences many forms of birth out of death. She sees the divine baby in a pillow or sometimes, perhaps 12 babies under the blankets. And this birth becomes associated with a resurrection, certainly with a rebirth. And she recognizes that that is what the encounter with death is all about. In a very dramatic vision, she sees the whole Bay Area drop down out of sight. And it's being replaced by some new world order coming from outer space. That becomes the new hell that's gone down below the surface. And this from outer space establishes a new heaven and a new earth, just like the prophets. At the center, San Francisco becomes the New Jerusalem. And this is a city of peace. It has a golden palace at its center. She sees many images of the world quadrated into 4 continents. This seems to be a very basic propensity of the psyche to arrange itself in these 4s. 4 continents, 4 ideologies, 4 colors, creeds and colors, and 4 directions. And at a certain point, she sees them clashing in conflict at the center, a great Armageddon or Ragnarok. And all goes dark and stormy, and it looks like the end of the world, but the sun comes out, and the storm passes over, and they come to peace with one another and learn to live together in a new world with harmony and mutual understanding and mutual tolerance. As I say, you wouldn't believe how many times this series of visions occurs in people who are just as out of left field with the psychosis as you can imagine. They come up quite spontaneously, and unfortunately in the profession, no one in the staff of the hospital talking with these people is allowed to listen to them. So here are visionary experiences that want to do some work, and we've demonstrated at Dionysius that in fact they can do work. It's a great time for therapy to connect these with everyday life, but it is absolutely happening nowhere in the United States at present. So the broader question is, what do we do with our visionaries? If madness takes over like this, to the point of some disorientation and distress, instantly we pull them out of it with isolation and medication. and we squelch by every means possible this process of vision making. So it's very clear that society is hostile to whatever deviates from the baseline. Too much excursion up, too much excursion down, that is not tolerated. Anything that departs from normative experience, it calls down a swift corrective and every effort put into restoring the so-called normal. However, if we live always at this baseline, always doing just what we're supposed to, safe, secure, approved, then there's no vision, no ecstasy, no Dionysus. And Dionysus then becomes locked out. But on the other hand, we become locked in. We're left inside this prison of safe security and consensus, convention. And Dionysus remains free outside to possess whom he will. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to break for lunch now. The doors of the auditorium will be closed during the lunch break. We resume at 1:45. The doors will be open 10 minutes before that, at 1:35. Have a great lunch. Enjoy the sunshine.